12 years ago, an 18-year-old young man vanished from his bedroom in Las Vegas, Nevada, in the quiet hours before dawn, a place that should have been a sanctuary from the outside world. The night air was still, the faint hum of streetlights bleeding through the blinds, and the usual reassuring clatter of the neighborhood was absent. Police initially considered the possibility that he had simply wandered off, perhaps to meet friends or explore, a choice made by an impulsive teenager. But his mother, who had always known the careful, responsible streak in her son, never believed such an explanation. She could feel, deep in her bones, that something far more sinister had occurred. The gap between that night and the moment when the truth would finally emerge spans exactly 12 years. For over a decade, Brian's name lingered in cold case files in the quiet archives of the Las Vegas Police Department. And yet, all that would change with a routine, modern process, a mundane requirement that would unexpectedly collide with a biological trace preserved from that night, forcing the past into the present in ways no one could have anticipated. Before the disappearance, Brian's life unfolded like a careful balance between adventure and responsibility. He lived in a modest suburban home on the outskirts of Las Vegas, where the desert stretched in muted golds and reds beyond the backyard fence. His bedroom was filled with the muted clutter of teenage life, worn hiking boots tucked under the bed, maps of nearby trails pinned to corkboards, and a carefully stacked pile of notebooks where he recorded his observations about local wildlife and rock formations. He loved the crisp mornings before school, the smell of toasted bread wafting from the kitchen, and the rhythmic chatter of his younger siblings as they prepared for their day. Friends described him as grounded, thoughtful, and quietly daring. While others might have rushed into new experiences, Brian approached them with a careful curiosity, always aware of safety, yet unwilling to miss the thrill of the unknown. He would spend weekends exploring the Red Rocks area, navigating paths that twisted between jagged cliffs and shaded canyons, marking each adventure with photographs and notes. At home, he maintained a tender routine, helping with household chores, checking in with family, sharing jokes over dinner, and retreating to his room to plan future excursions. These were the habits of a young man grounded in a predictable life, anchored by familial bonds and the small joys of everyday existence. And yet, beneath that normalcy, there was a quiet fragility. The desert nights, beautiful and serene, also held a whisper of vulnerability, a reminder that the world beyond the fence could intrude in ways no one expected. That very night, as shadows deepened and the neighborhood settled into sleep, the thin barrier between safety and danger would be crossed, shattering the sense of security that had defined Brian's world. Where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it there? Brian's home in Las Vegas had the familiar warmth of a well-lived space, a blend of family chaos and quiet corners of solace. The single-story house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac, its beige stucco walls catching the low evening light, and a small desert garden framed the front porch with resilient desert blooms. Inside, the house carried the scent of home-cooked meals, roast chicken, baked bread, and the lingering aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Family routines marked the rhythm of the day. Mornings were a flurry of school preparation, lunches packed carefully into small brown bags, and evenings were punctuated with shared dinners and casual conversation, often about the latest school news or weekend hiking plans. Brian shared the home with his parents and two younger siblings. His relationship with his mother was particularly close. She had always admired his thoughtfulness, his cautious curiosity, and the way he paid attention to the small details in life. His father, more reserved, respected Brian's independence, occasionally cautioning him about the hazards of venturing too far into the desert or taking risks with friends. Despite the occasional sibling squabble, the family's bonds were strong, threaded through shared routines and mutual care. His bedroom reflected both his adventurous spirit and meticulous nature. Maps of red rocks were pinned alongside small sketches of rock formations and wildlife. A backpack, carefully packed for his next weekend expedition, leaned against the wall. Flashlights, notebooks, and trail guides lay in neat piles, evidence of a young man who planned every step of his explorations. Yet, subtle vulnerabilities were present. The back door was often left unlocked during the dry summer months, and the bedroom window, framed by thin curtains, faced the quiet street, a possible point of observation for someone intent on intrusion. Neighbors and peripheral adults were familiar faces in Brian's life. The elderly man next door often watched the children with a cautious eye, offering a friendly wave each morning. The mail carrier, school bus driver, and a local handyman who came by for routine repairs were all accustomed to seeing Brian in his predictable patterns, leaving for school at 7:30 a.m., returning home in the afternoon to complete homework, then heading out again on weekend hikes. The predictability of his routines made his presence comforting, but also created a pattern that could be observed from outside the family's view. Evening descended with the quiet assurance of familiarity. The family settled into their nightly rhythm, the younger siblings brushing teeth and preparing for bed, the parents reviewing bills and work tasks, and Brian organizing his gear for the following day's excursion. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of a wall clock, and the distant murmur of cars passing along the nearby road created a soundscape of domestic normalcy. Outside, the desert air cooled rapidly, carrying the faint scent of sage and distant canyon dust. The setting sun cast long shadows across the living room, and the soft glow of lamps illuminated the edges of family photographs, capturing smiles frozen in time. Within his cocoon of routine, Brian's sense of security was palpable. Yet, the very elements that provided comfort, the predictable routines, the open windows, and the familiar streets also rendered him exposed to the unthinkable. In these final hours before the disappearance, nothing indicated the rupture that would soon shatter the family's world, leaving patterns of daily life disrupted and a void that would echo for years. The final day of Brian Bridges' normal life began as any other in August 2014. At 6:45 a.m., the desert air was warm but forgiving, the sun just beginning to light the distant red rock cliffs in muted golds. Brian moved through the morning routine with practiced ease, showering, dressing in his hiking-ready attire, and eating a quick breakfast prepared by his mother. His backpack, already packed with maps, snacks, and a small first-aid kit, sat by the front door, a silent testament to the adventures he loved. His younger siblings hurried through their routines, occasionally stealing glances at him with admiration. Aware of his responsibility yet envious of his freedom, school occupied the morning hours, as it always did. Brian maintained his usual attentiveness in class, exchanging notes with friends, asking questions that reflected his curiosity, and engaging in the occasional lighthearted teasing that brought laughter to the room. The day was ordinary, marked by the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant chime of bells, and the constant rhythm of footsteps along hallways. To any observer, nothing distinguished this day from hundreds before evening approached with a soft desert glow. At 5:10 p.m., Brian returned home, greeted by the familiar sense of a simmering dinner and the chatter of his family. He moved with the ease of routine, helping clear the table, checking his gear for the weekend, and chatting with his mother about minor plans for the next day. The family settled into their evening rituals, dishes washed, homework reviewed, and small talk weaving through the household. Outside, the wind stirred lightly, rustling dry leaves across the yard, while distant streetlights flickered on, casting long, thin shadows across the living room walls. As night deepened around 10:30 p.m., Brian prepared for bed. The bedroom light cast a warm glow, illuminating the sketches on the walls, the maps pinned with careful precision, and the neatly folded backpack by the door. His parents checked on the younger siblings before retiring themselves, and a quiet calm settled across the house. Yet, in that calm, a subtle disturbance emerged. His mother, half awake from the bedroom hallway, thought she saw a shadow bend near Brian's door. The figure was fleeting, indistinct, almost like a trick of the light or the mind. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and convinced herself it was nothing, a dream, perhaps, or a trick of fatigue. But deep down, she could not entirely shake the unease that pricked at her consciousness. By 5:50 a.m., the house was silent, and the desert sun had yet to crest the horizon. When Brian's mother awoke fully at 6:15 a.m., she noticed something impossible. Her son's bed was empty. The window she had checked the night before was closed, the door locked from the inside, and the backpack remained untouched. Alarm replaced grogginess, and a frantic search ensued. Rooms were swept, closets checked, and the backyard scoured in increasing panic. Nothing indicated where he might have gone. A phone call to neighbors revealed no sightings, no unexpected visitors, nothing to explain the absence of her son. The first patrol car arrived moments later, lights cutting through the early morning haze. The sheriff and deputy methodically surveyed the house, taking notes and photographs, cataloging every detail from the window latches to the patterns of footprints in the soft garden soil. Confusion turned to alarm as they realized this was no ordinary missing person case. Evidence suggested another presence had been inside the home, and a safe space had been violated in the quietest hours of the night. And if stories like this keep you pulled in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what comes next. The morning air carried a tense stillness as law enforcement began their meticulous survey of Brian Bridges' home. The sheriff, a seasoned figure in the small Las Vegas precinct, arrived with his deputy, their boots clicking softly on the worn wooden floors as they documented every detail. They moved deliberately, examining the bedroom first, the bed neatly made as if untouched, the maps and notebooks arranged in orderly stacks, and the window closed and latched. Yet subtle signs suggested intrusion: a faint smudge near the doorknob, a small scuff on the hardwood floor, and a shadow of disturbed dust along the windowsill. The mother recounted her brief, half-waking impression of a figure bending near Brian's door. Though she doubted herself, her account was recorded with care. Outside, the search expanded. Neighbors, friends, and volunteers moved quickly through the cul-de-sac, their anxious voices blending with the distant barks of neighborhood dogs. 9 units were called in, noses to the ground, tracing scents through yards and alleys. Beyond the immediate vicinity, fields stretched toward the red rocks, where hikers often wandered, and small desert trails snaked unpredictably through sagebrush and scrub. Volunteers combed each path, careful to avoid disturbing fragile evidence while remaining thorough. Close to the property, investigators found the first tangible clues. A small item belonging to Brian, a silver compass he had carried on hikes, lay partially hidden in the soft sand of the backyard. Its placement suggested it had been dropped or set aside in haste. Nearby, the grass had been flattened in a small patch, as if someone had knelt or paused there, and subtle drag marks led from the garden to the side gate. A single adult-sized footprint pressed into the soil pointed toward the street and then dissolved into the desert path, hinting at deliberate, calculated movement away from the home. Each piece of evidence, while limited, painted a chilling picture. The scene suggested that Brian had not left voluntarily, that someone had entered his sanctuary under the cover of night and taken him swiftly. Investigators photographed and bagged the compass, cast the footprint for records, and documented the disturbed areas with precision. Limited only by the tools available in 2014, forensic science could preserve traces. But the absence of modern DNA analysis meant that many potential leads relied heavily on physical observation and careful note-taking. The sheriff and his deputy lingered at the cluster of signs, the weight of realization settling in. This was not a simple runaway or teenage whim. Someone had planned, approached, and executed an intrusion, leaving minimal evidence yet enough to indicate intent and control. The neighborhood, previously so ordinary, had transformed into the scene of a carefully orchestrated abduction. As the sun rose higher over the desert, the search continued with increased urgency. Aerial reconnaissance was considered, drones not yet in common use in the precinct, but helicopters from a nearby state agency were contacted. Volunteers moved further into the outskirts, scanning the canyons and rocky paths that Brian had so often explored. Yet, as the day stretched on, the evidence remained sparse. A compass, a footprint, and the memory of a fleeting shadow, a collage of hints pointing to a grim reality that no one wanted to accept. In the quiet moments between the searches, the mother sat clutching Brian's favorite notebook, eyes scanning his handwriting, seeking comfort in the familiarity of his words. The weight of dread pressed on everyone involved, a creeping understanding that the night had not been a dream, that their young man was no longer within the safety of their home. Back at the sheriff's office, the small conference room was heavy with tension. The investigator and his deputy spread photographs, sketches, and notes across the table, reviewing the evidence collected during the first day of search. The compass, the flattened patch of grass, and the single adult-sized footprint were examined meticulously. As they traced the possible paths away from the home, a grim conclusion emerged. This was no ordinary disappearance. Brian Bridges had been taken from the safety of his bedroom, and the scene indicated deliberate planning. The case was formally reclassified from a simple missing person to an abduction, a term that carried both urgency and dread. Acknowledging the worst while admitting how little could be known, early suspects were drawn from the perimeter of Brian's life. People who had access to his home or routine. Neighbors, a handyman who occasionally performed repairs, a delivery driver familiar with the cul-de-sac, and even some older friends who had been trusted with keys were quietly examined. One individual became the prime focus, a repairman who had visited the house within days of the disappearance and had no immediate alibi for the night in question. His record and demeanor raised red flags, a brief inconsistency in his schedule, a nervous recounting of his presence in the area. Interrogation unfolded methodically. Investigators noted discrepancies and probing gaps in the man's timeline, building suspicion with careful attention. But objective evidence soon exonerated him. A local utility record proved he was across town at the exact hour Brian vanished, and shoe tread analysis showed a mismatch with the print found near the house. With his name cleared, the case widened in uncertainty, tension mounting as the trail to the true perpetrator remained invisible. The red herring, while frustrating, demonstrated the investigative diligence of the local authorities. The search expanded over the following days. Teams combed nearby canyons, desert trails, and hidden alcoves Brian often explored. State police advisors reviewed the limited evidence, noting the abduction's calm, controlled execution. Whoever had taken him had a knowledge of the terrain, a quiet efficiency that left almost no trace. Volunteers scoured every footpath, water source, and rocky outcrop. Yet the young man remained absent, leaving only speculation in his wake, with no new leads. No eyewitnesses and no ransom demands. The case began to stall. Administratively, the file was eventually marked as inactive, a cold case boxed away in the precinct archives. The physical evidence, the compass, the footprint, the photographs was preserved but largely untouched. Emotional fallout was immediate and lasting. Brian's mother and father carried guilt and despair, replaying every routine, every warning ignored, every night they had failed to see the danger. Siblings felt the void keenly, the home irreparably altered by absence. Investigators themselves bore quiet wounds, the failure to find Brian haunting their professional and personal lives. A reminder that evil can act swiftly while the world watches. IMPOTENTL. Y. As the last evidence box was placed on the storage shelf, a small handwritten label read, Brian Bridges, 2014. The weight of years yet to come settled on that simple tag. A silent testimony to the stolen time and the mysteries that remained. If you want to know what investigators uncovered next, go ahead and like this video. Years stretched into decades, and the city of Las Vegas shifted around the stillness of Brian Bridges' disappearance. Streets once familiar evolved, new subdivisions replaced open desert. Businesses opened and closed, and the constant hum of urban growth layered over the quiet cul-de-sac where his home still stood. Police staff changed as veteran officers retired and new investigators took their places, their digital records cataloging new crimes while the old box sat largely untouched. Through office reorganizations, roof leaks, and occasional flood scares, the evidence box labeled Brian Bridges, 2014, survived almost by accident. A fragile vessel preserving a frozen moment of terror. Inside that box lay the preserved compass, footprint casts, photographs, and the painstaking notes of the original investigation. Each item told a fragment of the story, yet decades passed without anyone acting upon them. Family photographs, letters, and mementos kept by Brian's mother and siblings reminded them daily of the absence, but life demanded continuation. His younger siblings grew into adulthood carrying the ache of incompleteness, choosing sometimes to speak of Brian, other times to suppress the memory entirely. Friends scattered, moved, and created lives of their own, occasionally glancing back at old social media posts or yearbooks with quiet longing. The retired investigator often walked past the dusty shelves during departmental reorganizations, pausing at the box and recalling the panic, confusion, and dread of those first frantic days. The unanswered questions had left him unsettled, and though the case was officially inactive, it never fully left his consciousness. He would recount the minimal evidence to new recruits as an example of both procedural diligence and the limits of investigation in a world without modern forensic tools. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to all, Ryan had been living elsewhere under a carefully constructed false identity. Years had passed, and he existed in a parallel life attending school or work, forming connections under another name, yet always carrying an inexplicable sense of dislocation. Fragments of memories intruded unexpectedly, a fleeting image of the backyard he had grown up in, a scent from the kitchen he could not place, the shadow of a mother he did not recognize fully. Small moments of unease and alienation marked his daily existence, never allowing him full peace, never permitting him the feeling of truly belonging. The system of the era had gaps that allowed this hidden life to continue unchallenged. Paper records were siloed, counties did not share data consistently, and there was no centralized registry to connect missing persons across jurisdictions. Teachers, employers, and minor officials sensed irregularities, odd documents, inconsistent backstories, but lacked both the authority and the tools to probe further. The young man moved through life quietly, skilled at blending in while quietly wondering if the world he had lost would ever reach out for him. Yet the evidence box persisted. Its survival was almost miraculous, a dormant connection between past and future, waiting for a catalyst to bridge the years. In the shadows of decades-long absence, hope remained fragile but intact, residing in both the preserved traces and the eventual possibility that the truth might one day emerge. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? Under a new identity, Brian Bridges had grown into adulthood, shaped by the dissonance of a life lived under someone else's design. In his mid-20s, he lived quietly in a modest apartment on the outskirts of a suburban town far from Las Vegas. The walls were sparsely decorated. A few framed photos of distant landscapes, hinting at his ongoing love for hiking and exploration. Paperwork littered the desk. Employment applications listing inconsistent birth dates, school records with slightly altered names, and medical forms referencing vague parental histories. Each document was a thread in the carefully woven fabric of his false life. A life that shielded him from the truth, but also kept him suspended in quiet unease. Despite outward normalcy, Brian felt a chronic sense of dislocation. Dreams and sudden flashes of another home, the warm kitchen smells, the texture of his childhood bedroom, the sound of his mother's voice would surface without warning. He could not place these images or reconcile them with his present reality. Relationships were tentative. He maintained friendships and professional connections, but something intangible always set him apart. The rhythm of daily life was measured, safe, and controlled, yet it never felt fully his own. The systemic blind spots of earlier decades allowed this hidden existence to continue unchallenged. No central databases linked records across states, and DNA technology had yet to become integrated into routine checks. Paper files remained siloed, and authorities had no reason to suspect that a young man working quietly in a distant town was in fact a long missing teenager from Las Vegas. The turning point arrived through an ordinary, seemingly mundane process, a requirement for employment verification tied to a government contract. Brian submitted fingerprints and identification documents, unaware that this routine bureaucratic step would intersect with preserved traces from the past. In a matter of hours, his biometric data entered the national database. A match was flagged immediately, linking the fingerprints from his application to a trace collected 12 years earlier at his childhood home, the very night he vanished at the cold case unit in Las Vegas. A modern investigator, a meticulous and emotionally attuned officer, received the alert. Eye scanning the details, the investigator noted the incredible temporal gap. Fingerprints connecting an adult man to an abduction scene over a decade prior. Heartbeats of past and present aligned in a single electrifying moment. Pulling the original case file from storage, the investigator carefully reviewed every note, photograph, and evidence bag, aware that the preserved box contained the key to finally understanding what had happened on that fateful night. For Brian, the world remained unaware of the storm about to reach him. The life he had built, the routines he had clung to, and the identity he had come to inhabit were all on the verge of being disrupted by a truth that had waited patiently for years. And in the quiet of the investigative office, as modern technology began to speak across the decades, the long-buried reality of his disappearance prepared to emerge. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? The cold case investigator approached the evidence with a practiced precision born of years handling dormant files. Methodical and quietly patient, they spread the original materials across a brightly lit lab table. Photographs faded with time. The single adult-sized footprint cast in plaster, the carefully bagged compass, and typed reports from the initial investigation. Each item carried the weight of unresolved grief and unanswered questions. Yet now, with modern forensic tools, the past could speak in ways once impossible. Samples were sent to state-of-the-art laboratories. Fibers from the carpet near the bedroom, traces of soil from the footprint, and minute hairs collected from the compass were analyzed. Soil analysis, previously limited to visual inspection, now linked the tracks to specific terrain features near the abductor's later residences, a subtle but irrefutable geographic fingerprint. The footprint cast was compared against digital databases of shoe tread patterns, revealing a model and style consistent with the professional footwear the abductor was known to wear at the time, a small, specific clue now elevated to decisive significance. Utility, tax, and rental records were cross-referenced with the dates of Brian's disappearance. The investigator meticulously reconstructed the suspect's movements, identifying gaps where no conventional documentation existed, but where circumstantial evidence aligned perfectly with the opportunity for abduction. Each thread, once disparate, now wove into a coherent timeline, a calculated, deliberate intrusion into a home once thought safe, executed with knowledge of the household, routines and surrounding terrain. The merging of old evidence with modern forensic capabilities allowed the investigator to build a detailed profile. The abductor's residences, workplaces, and travel patterns revealed a chilling consistency, familiarity with the Red Rocks region, the ability to remain unseen, and the patience to orchestrate a disappearance without leaving overt traces. Administrative records corroborated the suspect's presence in Las Vegas at the precise time of Brian's vanishing, while later digital and geospatial mapping confirmed routes consistent with the preserved footprint and drag marks. Finally, the evidence converged on a single conclusion. The adult identified in Brian's modern fingerprint match was indeed the long-missing teenager, and every preserved trace from the abduction pointed to one primary offender. While the abductor's current status varied, some suspects alive, others deceased, the investigation could officially name the individual as the perpetrator, responsible for orchestrating Brian's disappearance. The file, dormant for 12 years, was now active, complete with forensic certainty, administrative corroboration, and a reconstructed timeline that left little room for doubt. The investigator prepared the next steps with care, understanding the delicate nature of reintroducing a truth that had been hidden for over a decade. Notifications, DNA verification, and eventual reunification plans were outlined, each move informed by both the precision of modern forensics and the sensitivity required when dealing with a life fractured by prolonged absence. In a quiet office, surrounded by decades of paperwork, the final pieces fell into place, bridging past and present with an unyielding clarity. Brian Bridges sat in a sterile, sunlit conference room, the hum of fluorescent lights mingling with the quiet tension that seemed to pulse through the air. Law enforcement officers explained, in calm, measured tones, that his fingerprint submitted months earlier for a routine employment check-matched the evidence preserved from the night of his disappearance in 2014. Brian's mind recoiled against the revelation, struggling to reconcile the life he had lived with the shadowed reality of his past. Shock, disbelief, and a sudden grief mingled with relief, creating a swirl of emotions that made him feel unmoored, as though the ground beneath his carefully constructed existence had shifted. DNA samples were requested from surviving biological relatives, his parents and younger siblings, many now adults themselves. The process was precise, clinical, and yet profoundly human. When the results returned, they confirmed the impossible: a direct, unbroken bloodline linking Brian Bridges to the family who had mourned him for 12 long years. Tears welled in the eyes of the mother who had never stopped hoping, in the father who had replayed every detail of that fateful night in anguish, and in the siblings who had grown into adulthood carrying the weight of absence. The first in-person reunion was quiet, intimate, and searingly emotional. Brian's mother reached out, her hand trembling as it met the adult son she had lost. Recognition bloomed not only through shared DNA, but in subtle, ineffable ways. A tilt of the head, a familiar hesitation in speech, the way he smiled, the cadence of his voice. The family traced small, cherished memories together: a childhood game, a favorite snack, the way he used to fold maps before hikes. Each recollection stitched together a fragment of the life that had been stolen. Even as Brian shared stories of the identity he had been forced to inhabit, years lived under another name. Memories that did not fully belong, the persistent sense of displacement. Integration was not simple. Brian struggled with the reality of the stolen past, the life he might have had, and the identity that had been imposed upon him. His family navigated their own conflicting emotions: joy at reunion, anger at the abductor, and grief for the irretrievable years. Yet amid the complexity, there was an undeniable thread of restoration, the affirmation of who Brian was, the official acknowledgement that he had survived, and the closure that came with naming the child they had mourned as still living in the precinct. The cold case investigator documented every step, noting the emotional, procedural, and forensic milestones. The file was updated to reflect the confirmed identity, the match of preserved evidence, and the resolution of the abduction. Yet even as the paperwork was completed, the investigator understood that personal healing, though aided by truth, was only beginning. The ripples of trauma, absence, and recovery would continue in quiet, intimate ways, far beyond the reach of official reports. The convergence of preserved evidence, modern forensics, and patient bureaucracy had finally restored a life once thought lost. In the soft light of the conference room, Brian's family embraced him fully, acknowledging both the lost years and the resilient presence that had returned to them. The case, resolved on paper, now carried the weight of emotional truth, a testament to the enduring impact of vigilance, hope, and the painstaking work of those who refused to let time erase justice. With Brian Bridges' identity confirmed, the case file was formally updated. The abductor, whose meticulous planning had allowed years of concealment, was officially named as the primary offender, and the original 2014 incident was reclassified in the records as an abduction, consistent with contemporary legal definitions. The resolution brought a sense of closure to the administrative process, but unanswered questions remained. Why had the abductor acted with such calculated precision? Could earlier interventions have realistically prevented the crime? And might. There have been other victims whose experiences remained obscured in silence. These questions lingered, reminders that even the most thorough investigations cannot always illuminate every shadow of human malice. The systemic lessons of the case were profound. The survival of the evidence box, despite decades of risk from flooding, purges, and organizational change, underscored the importance of careful record preservation. The intersection of Brian's ordinary bureaucratic requirement with a modern fingerprint database highlighted the critical value of cross-jurisdictional information sharing and the power of technological tools to connect past and present. Moreover, early witness accounts, the fleeting shadow seen by Brian's mother, demonstrated the necessity of documenting and believing vulnerable observations, even when they initially seem ambiguous or uncertain. For Brian, the truth arrived late, yet its impact reshaped his life. The restoration of his identity validated the memories of his family, repaired fractured bonds, and allowed him to reclaim a narrative stolen by abduction. He carried with him the duality of two lifetimes, the one imposed upon him, and the one to which he was born. While the stolen years could never be replaced, the acknowledgement of their reality, the reunification with family, and the official recognition of the abduction offered both dignity and justice in the quiet of his family home. The desert light, filtering through the windows, Brian and his relatives reflected on the complexity of time lost and found. Emotions ran deep relief tempered by grief, anger softened by understanding, and joy tinged with the melancholy of irretrievable moments. The case was resolved in paperwork and DNA, but its human resonance extended far beyond the precinct or lab. It was a story of resilience, of the perseverance of truth, and of the unyielding effort of those who never let the past remain buried. Late justice, even after 12 years, proved its worth not in spectacle, but in quiet restoration. The meticulous preservation of evidence, the diligence of modern investigators, and the unbroken hope of a family had converged to restore the life and name of Brian Bridges. Those scars remained, both visible and invisible, The final narrative allowed the victim and his family to reclaim agency over what had been taken, and to honor the strength required to survive the unknown. And when you're ready, click the video on the right to explore another case.